Hello, and welcome to Two Pews in a Pod. Join us as we explore faith in a modern world at Evangelical Lutheran Church in Frederick, Maryland. Now, here is your host, Pastor Paul Baglios.
I'm Paul Baglios. Welcome again to another episode of Two Pews in a Pod, a podcast of Evangelical Lutheran Church here in Frederick, Maryland. I am again joined by my colleague on staff, Daniel Catalano, our Director of Music Ministries. This is the second of 4 episodes that we are intending to do together on the Episcopal Church. And today, we're going to focus this episode, our conversation, on something I know is so dear to Daniel's heart, and it is dear as well to mine, and that is the Book of Common Prayer. I'm holding up one of my own copies of this book, which I do indeed treasure. But I'm going to suggest, Daniel, that we move into this episode. Tell us about this particular book, what its achievement represents in the history of the Church of England and the Episcopal Church, and how this book, I said to you earlier today, how and why this book serves as one of the key markers of Episcopal identity.
Well, I was looking very much forward to this topic, because often Episcopalians, when we are given reference to the good book, we mean the Book of Common Prayer. I mean, the Bible is, yes, just as important, but this is the good book. So it's interesting to think about not only the practicality of the Book of Common Prayer, which developed with our Catholic roots, with multiple missals or books used to instruct or to lead various services, way to combine something so it's one source. The name in and of itself, for common prayer, so that those who are ordained, those who are not ordained, the laity, the majority of the church, can find a way to practice, give language to just the devoted worship of God. So it's got a lot to it. The history, which I have found fascinating, and is sort of, it reflects the Reformation and what was going on in England, thinking about our last episode. So almost every prayer that's in here, every collect, every sort of long-standing chunk of words, so to speak, is based on Scripture. If you think back to what was going on in the English Reformation, you had, as we mentioned, the Reformers, the Puritans, those who wanted to really go back to Holy Scripture. That is our center. And the more papal influence, where people didn't want to give up the ceremony. They wanted to have that rich ritual. And so the Book of Common Prayer, which went through a number of revisions, was essentially a compromise. The way that it's phrased, that yes, we have these particular liturgies, yes, we have the elevation of the Eucharist, yes, there are all of these different masses that can be done by the people of God, but we're not just adding words of fluff that we found from some other place, that this is... hearing this is also praying Scripture, and so there's I think realizing all of that, I think, gives way more weight that the editors have had. Now, there's of course some variations in various prayers and collects, but even the Eucharistic prayers that are set, both A, B, C, and D, are inspired, if not direct quotes from Holy Scripture, which is not, it's not to say that other denominations did not do that, but the particular historical significance, how they got this through the politically and religious turbulent times, this was the answer, and this was how they got it.
Well, and I would say I also am holding on my table, we'll talk about some comparisons later, currently, Evangelical Lutheran Worship. It is the primary congregational worship resource used now in most congregations of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, including ELC here in Frederick. Here too, and this really goes deep into the Western liturgical tradition, that the liturgy, the shape, the form, the movement of the liturgy, as it is shared by so many different Christian traditions, is really a way of praying, reciting, confessing, singing the scriptures.
Yes. Well, and I think part of that and honoring the monastic history, both, and because the ELW is the same way, that it's interesting that the only book from the Bible that's in completion are the Psalms. And we see that in the ELW.
And here too. Yes, and in fact, with the publication of the ELW,
right,
that was new for us Lutherans in North America.
Right.
Our previous primary worship books used by congregations of this denomination and predecessor bodies, the practice had been to only include psalms that were appointed in the lectionary.
Okay.
And not the entire Psalter makes its appearance in the Revised Common Lectionary, but with the preparation and publication of Evangelical Lutheran Worship, the entire book of Psalms is included. And I love the fact that they are placed and numbered so that they are the first 150 hymns in the hymn section.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Yeah, no, it's curious because often, I mean, there are a number of reasons, and depending on who you ask, we'll give the most important reason. You can think of the Psalms as looking back to our own Jewish heritage, that it was, David writing the Psalms, praying through the Psalms, that are monastic movements. The monastic movement taking back to the English church of the 4th century, that the Psalms were this very human reaction, very human writing and response to God. While all scripture is, that so much, I think, meets people where they are. And I think in the intention of the common prayer, the common person, I think that was, for me, that resonates the most, which is why it's there.
Well, you noted before we sat down to record this episode, you noted that one of the primary differences between the Book of Common Prayer and the liturgical books of many other traditions, including the Lutheran Church, is that the Book of Common Prayer is a liturgical resource. It is not a hymnal.
Right.
There are no hymns in the Book of Common Prayer. So tell us, what's in this? Because I'll just hold up for those who may be watching.
Right.
These are books of similar thickness.
Right. Well, and
so since you don't have any hymns,
yeah,
what's all this stuff?
What else do you got?
Yep.
So, one of the major aspects is that within the Episcopal Church, until we have another convention and vote on another kind of rite, there are two rites, Rite 1 and Rite 2. To honor the history of the Episcopal Church, they have both morning prayer, evening prayer, and the Eucharist services in what's known as Rite 1, which for those of you listening at home is essentially the Queen's English, or the King's English, for it is meet and right so to do.
Think thee and thy.
These and thys all throughout. It's interesting hearing some of my seminary friends. There are many congregations who, there's one in Alaska that I'm thinking, but there are many congregations who, for whatever reason, their primary Sunday Eucharistic worship is Rite 1. And it developed, part of it developed through time, switching then to Rite 2, more of the common tongue, the more vernacular, less of these and thys, more of yours.
Contemporary English language usage.
Yes. There are some who are arguing for a Rite 3, which I think that's a different podcast. That's a whole different bit. But so that's part of what we have at the beginning. At the opening we have a calendar of all the feast days, and then right into it, the first opening pages is what's known as the daily office. Now, office, fancy word for service. It takes back to the monastic period where they prayed the offices. You have, it's like 6 a.m., the matins, and so on, where you have the various 6 or 7 times you pray a day. And the compromise, again, from the sort of Catholic side versus the more Reformed side, it used to have more. And so historically, Christians prayed in the morning and they prayed in the evening as a way to meet some of the more the different hours. There's a noonday prayer, and there's also Compline, which has taken a number of names. Vespers is another name as well. So in total, when you think about the daily offices, there are 4 that we recognize.
So we could do, without just reading table of contents, we could do a bit of comparison. So in Evangelical Lutheran worship, there is, and I'm going to say what you've already said, which is also in this particular book, there is a service of morning prayer. There is a service of evening prayer.
Right.
Those two are sometimes called matins and vespers, respectively. There is a service for prayer at the end of the day, or Compline. We do not have in this book a particular service for noon, but we have shorter orders of a prayer service that could be used at various times of the day, sometimes simply called suffrages.
Interesting. Well, and it's the suffrages, that language is used as just a sort of prayers of intercession, but suffrages is still used. That's often when I lead morning prayer. They'll look like, I know most of these words. What's a suffrage? And so it's good to see that, that it's not just Episcopalians who use those that kind of verbiage, but that's beautiful. I think to have moments of accessibility, and I think primarily the first half of this book is, apart from the Eucharist services, is to provide for the people of God a way to, okay, you're with your friends, you're with family, you're with yourself. How do I pray? Any way of prayer is accessible, but if you want this kind of language, here is a form, here are collects and prayers. So it's lovely to have that. We have a number of canticles, just as the ELW does, and it's all, there are a number of litanies that follow with the collects as well. It's curious that certain holidays or feast days are in this book. Many of the lesser feasts, the saints' days and so on, have a separate book, but in the Book of Common Prayer, after the collects, we have the liturgy for Ash Wednesday. We have Palm Sunday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter Vigil. Liturgies for baptisms, and then it gets into the Eucharist. So it's
similar for this book.
Yeah. So it's all it's a really great resource for people as they go on, and I just flipped straight to the Psalms.
You mentioned something, and I don't know if this is of interest to many people, but there have often been times in my own prayer life or devotional life that I have made use of a personal copy of ELW or the Book of Common Prayer.
Right.
On the shelves behind me, I've got other resources, some Methodist and some Presbyterian.
Yeah, I saw that too, yeah.
And I often think, because you can get what are smaller print, they're often called personal size editions of this. I have a personal size edition of the Book of Common Prayer that I have often carried with me. In a perfect world, I would love to see every member of the congregation have their own personal copy of Evangelical Lutheran worship, and to find it helpful in their daily prayer and devotional life.
Well, and I think for other denominations, particularly if you zoom out within just the Episcopal Church and then the Anglican Communion. One particular prayer book that I've found to be very helpful has been the New Zealand prayer book. That part of the Anglican Communion is pretty much where the English Empire was. So if they were there, there's probably an Anglican church, and we can unpack that on another
colonizing.
Colonize. Yeah, well, we can unpack that for another podcast. But they have developed a wonderful and rich prayer book for that very purpose. They have. And I would have brought mine with me, but they have even morning and evening prayers specifically for every day, because they found that just having the same prayer there as with the Book of Common Prayer, that it helped for some, but it was nice to have almost this customizable devotional material. And that's really what it's there for. It's not necessarily meant to be on your shelf to use as a reference book occasionally. It's meant to be used. It's meant to be worn and prayed through. One interesting aspect as a method is if you begin praying the Psalms, and I'm not sure if the ELW has it as well, but there is a way to pray the Psalms in 30 days. And so you underneath you have book 1 for the first Psalm, and in italics, which is not required, but it says first.
I'm checking.
Yes. Well, I had a good Episcopal beginning on page 585 of the good book. In italics, it says first day morning prayer. And so you'll go through and read through Psalm 1, Psalm 2, Psalm 3, Psalm 4, and 5, which can go by quite easily because they're not terribly long. But then at the bottom, beginning for Psalm 6, it says first day evening prayer. And so it's a way for you to, can have online resources for Scripture. If you want to pray morning and evening prayer, it will just go through, and in 30 days, you would have read all 150 of the Psalms.
So the Psalms in evangelical Lutheran worship are not marked in that way, but those sorts of guides for reading are readily available. I'm looking to see here, because I think I'm correct, but I might not be. Oh, yes. In addition to finding here the lectionary and prayers of the day for the whole church year, there is a daily lectionary in evangelical Lutheran worship. And this was a feature in some of the predecessor resources to this book. I'm going to flip to it because I want to see, I do think it includes daily readings of the Psalms, but I want to make sure. And in fact, it does. The daily lectionary includes readings from the book of Psalms for every day.
One thing I will say I very much appreciate about the ELW, and I have a copy of my own from a dear friend of mine, is that for some of the offices, it has music, not only the text of the liturgy, but music put in. So for us musically inclined, or for those who want to be musically inclined, if you're by yourself or with others, that there's an opportunity for you to sing or to chant the liturgy, which to me enhances it and gives that possibility.
Well, and everything in here includes musical setting. There is no music in the Book of Common Prayer. It's text.
Yes. Well, and part of that, I'm sure, came out of the early development within the colonial years and the early stages of the church. But it is interesting that the two books, they've sort of, you can just hold on to both of them, but the merging has not been... I take that back. I think there have been some proposals of having that sort of combined resource, but I think the overwhelming consensus has just been to let's keep this as a not only historical, but a prayerful resource, and if music wants to be added, there's another resource for that.
I'm curious to know, because I don't know. For those who are ordained as Episcopal priests, if they are now in congregational ministry and they're leading, say, a congregation in the Eucharist, So they're making use of the Book of Common Prayer, a prescribed liturgical form, whether Rite 1 or Rite 2. How much leeway do they have with the prescribed texts?
Well, that's
must one go buy the book?
What a great question. Well, and I think one of the big things that I have found, particularly just looking side by side, is you have to ask your bishop. That's usually what happens. Most times, I mean, I'm not going to speak of any particular bishops that I know, but some are very flexible, that they just want to know, okay, it's not a problem, but thank you for letting me know. Others will say, I really want you to stay in this, and I would prefer that you would. A part of it is depending on the relationship that clergy have with their bishop and sort of what that means for common prayer. That prayer, praying the same creeds. I mean, and I feel this way with most denominations, that when I'm praying any of the creeds, when I'm praying the Lord's Prayer, it is this, and sort of that prayerful unifying feeling, I think, is something that's really at the heart of why we appreciate this book. But as I was reminded this last go around in seminary, I was reminded that when any clergy serve in the Episcopal Church at the table, they are serving in the stead of their bishop. And so there is where I think within the ELCA, they have, I think, a slightly different view on that, but whenever Episcopal clergy is serving, it is in the stead of their bishop. And so that connection between, well, I'd like to try this, I'd like to try that. Now, I know a number of Episcopal clergy who have good relationships with their bishops, and who their bishops are like, great, let's try something new, let's look at that. But it's more of a conversation than asking permission, but that conversation needs to happen, because that is our understanding of the episcopate.
Well, and we may, hopefully, in the next episode, we'll get into that a bit. And that actually goes back to some of the earliest centuries of Christian history. What developed over time is what Christians refer to as the threefold order of ordained ministry. Bishop, pastor, deacon. Yes. That's not a ranking,
right?
But three different offices. Lutheran practice emphasizes two. While we have bishops who serve the church, bishops in our practice are not ordained to that office. They are pastors who are elected to serve as bishops. But in the ancient church, when the threefold order was emerging, bishop was synonymous in many cases with pastor. The bishop would be the pastor of a parish. Right. And if it was a large and well-populated parish, there would be presbyters, one could almost say like assistant bishops, who might have responsibilities for local neighborhoods.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that you bring that up, and I appreciate that, because often we as an Episcopal seminarians are given this book to read it, to study it, to look at the ordination rites, and they use that language. Will you, as presbyter, all of that rich history is still part of this book, where, God willing, people consenting, bishop allowing, that, when I become, if that is the case, ordained.
I have every confidence.
Well, I appreciate
and I'll remind you, there's always a home for you
my gosh.
in the ELCA.
But that kind of language of the presbyter, of the things that are not normally put in for our denomination, that history is still present in the liturgy, and I think it's important for people to even to recognize it or understand that that's a long lineage that we Christians call back to. So,
well, we will have plenty yet to talk about in two other intended episodes in this series about the Episcopal Church, but we'll stop for this particular episode. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
This is fun to do with you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you to those of you who have logged in to listen or to watch. I'm Paul Baglios.
Daniel Catalano.
We'll see you next time on Two Pews in a Pod.
This has been Two Pews in a Pod, a podcast hosted by the lead pastor of Evangelical Lutheran Church in Frederick, Maryland. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.